Hey everyone, welcome to the show. You ever imagine a world where just the idea of freedom was so powerful that it started a war across Europe?
Oh, yeah.
That's the world we're diving into today. A deep dive
Oh,
into historical nonfiction, Summer of Fire and Blood by Lyndal Roper.
all right.
If you love history that feels shockingly relevant today, hit that like button and subscribe. We'll
Mm,
have a link to the book in the description below. It's the story of the German Peasants' War. A conflict so brutal and so full of hope, it really makes you question everything you thought you knew about power, religion, and revolution.
absolutely. Yeah. What's captivating about this book is it really transports you right to the early 1500s, a time when Germany wasn't even a unified country, just a patchwork of territories within the Holy Roman Empire.
Right.
Roper really brings this world to life, describing like these towering castles and bustling marketplaces and the just overwhelming influence of the Catholic Church, you know?
Yeah. Okay, so paint a picture for me. What was life actually like for the average person in this era?
Well, life for most was rural, tied to the land. Whether you were a serf bound to a lord or a free tenant, you faced increasing burdens, taxes, restrictions.
Right.
Imagine feeling the weight of like an entire social system, like pressing down on you, limiting your choices, opportunities, even your sense of self.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this wasn't just like a few isolated incidents of unrest. It sounds like there was a real systemic issue brewing.
Exactly, yeah. Rupert emphasizes that this wasn't just some sudden explosion.
Mm.
For decades, there'd been these small revolts simmering beneath the surface. The book mentions groups like the Poor Conrads who challenged unfair taxes and went so far as to hold, like, a symbolic trial for a rigged weight by throwing it into a river.
Wow, that's a powerful image. It sounds like they were really starting to question the legitimacy of the entire system.
Absolutely. And this sense of discontent was further fueled by religious figures like the drummer of Nicolashausen,
Right.
who led a movement challenging the church's authority. His dramatic burning at the stake, it just added fuel to the fire, creating this network of resistance just waiting for the right moment to ignite.
And then along comes Martin Luther's, right? Here's where things get really interesting. Luther's Reformation was already shaking the foundations of the church, but did he end up supporting the peasants' cause?
That's the fascinating tension at the heart of this story. Luther's all about spiritual freedom, encouraging people to find their own path to God.
Mm-hmm.
But the peasants took his message a step further, demanding freedom from these oppressive social structures. They saw Luther as a model of defiance, remembering him standing up to the emperor at Worms and refusing to back down unless he was convinced by scripture.
Right. That was a pivotal moment in history. So how did Luther respond when the peasants actually revolted? Did he embrace their cause or did he back away?
Well, the peasants, they presented their demands in a remarkably sophisticated document called the 12 Articles.
Okay.
They demanded the right to choose their own pastors, access to resources like forests and water, and fair treatment under the law.
So they weren't just an angry mob. They had a clear vision for a more just society,
Precisely. And they used this powerful religious language to make their case,
right?
stating, it has until now been the custom for the lords to own us as their property. This is deplorable, for Christ redeemed and bought us all with his precious blood.
Right.
The lowliest shepherd as well as the greatest lord, with no exceptions. This really shows how they were intertwining their spiritual beliefs with their fight for social change.
That's an incredibly powerful statement. It really underscores the depth of their convictions. But what about Luther? Did he ultimately support them?
That's where the story takes this kind of heartbreaking turn. Despite initially sympathizing with the peasants' plight, Luther ultimately sided with the princes. Fearing the chaos and upheaval of a full-blown revolution, he called for the rebels to be put down, a decision that had these far-reaching consequences for both the Reformation and the peasants themselves.
So the peasants found themselves caught between a rock and a hard place. They were inspired by Luther's message of freedom, but when they tried to put it into practice, they faced opposition from the very person they thought would be their champion.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a tragic irony that highlights the complexities of this period and the difficult choices that people faced when trying to navigate this shifting landscape of power, faith, and social change.
And how did the peasants respond to Luther's rejection? Did they back down or did they decide to fight back?
They chose to fight. They formed armies, they chose leaders, developed strategies, transforming from just a collection of disgruntled individuals into a powerful force for change.
Oh, wow.
Imagine thousands of peasants armed with whatever they could find, marching across the countryside, laying siege to castles, and taking control of towns.
Wow, so they weren't just passively protesting, they were ready to fight for their beliefs. Who were some of the key figures leading these peasant armies?
The book highlights figures like Hans Miller of Bulgenbach, a charismatic ex-mercenary who knew how to rally and inspire troops. And then there was Thomas Mintzer, a radical theologian who envisioned a society based on equality and shared resources. These were people who truly believed they could create a better world, and they were willing to risk everything to make it happen.
It's mind-blowing to think about these ordinary people just rising up and challenging the entire established order. What were some of the tactics they used? Did they just rely on brute force, or was there more to their strategy?
That's what makes the story so compelling. The peasants were incredibly strategic. They understood the power of symbols.
Okay.
For example, they targeted monasteries, seeing them as representations of wealth and power within the feudal system.
So it wasn't just about random acts of violence. They were going after specific targets that represented the system they were fighting against.
Exactly, and they weren't just driven by, material concerns. They also resented the monks' privileged lifestyle, which seemed at odds with their vows of poverty. They saw the monasteries as obstacles to their desire for religious freedom, specifically their right to choose their own pastors and control their own religious practices.
It's fascinating how they were weaving together these social, economic, and religious threads into a cohesive movement. Was there anything else that surprised you about their tactics?
Well, one of the most intriguing aspects of the peasant movement was their concept of brotherhood.
Mm.
They offered it to lords, towns, even to each other, forging alliances and creating this sense of unity that transcended their differences.
So it was about more than just fighting against something. They were also fighting for something, a sense of community, solidarity, and shared purpose.
Precisely. And this wasn't just empty rhetoric.
Right.
They lived out this brotherhood by sharing food, drink, and hardship, demonstrating their commitment to a more egalitarian and compassionate way of life.
It makes you wonder if they had succeeded, what kind of society they might have created. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's talk about what ultimately led to their downfall.
Well, as we discussed, the peasants faced opposition not only from the princes and the church, but also from Luther himself.
Right.
And while they had early successes, they were ultimately outmatched in terms of resources, weaponry, and military expertise.
Right.
The turning point came at the Battle of Frankenhausen, where Minzer's army was decisively defeated.
So even though they had this burning passion and a clear vision, they just couldn't overcome the sheer force arrayed against them.
Sadly, that's the case. The Battle of Frankenhausen marked the beginning of a brutal crackdown, what Roper calls the Summer of Blood. Tens of thousands of peasants were slaughtered, their leaders executed, and their dreams of a better world seemingly crushed.
It's heartbreaking to think about the scale of the violence and the crushing defeat they faced. It makes you wonder, did any of their ideas survive? Did their struggle leave any lasting impact?
That's a crucial question, and Roper argues that while the peasants may have lost the war, their ideas did simply vanish. Their demands for social justice, their emphasis on communal decision-making, and their vision of a more egalitarian society continued to resonate, planting seeds that would sprout in later movements for social change.
So even though they faced unimaginable brutality, their struggle wasn't entirely in vain. Their story still has something to teach us today.
Absolutely. Their fight for freedom and dignity continues to inspire us.
Right.
Roper makes this compelling case that their story offers valuable lessons about the dangers of inequality, the importance of fighting for what you believe in, and the enduring power of collective action.
I'm struck by how this story, which took place over 500 years ago, feels so relevant to our own time. We're still grappling with many of the same issues: inequality, social justice, the role of religion in society.
That's one of the most powerful aspects of this book. It shows how history isn't just something that happened in the past. It's this living force that shapes our present and our future.
Roper also draws some fascinating parallels between the peasant struggles and the modern environmental movement, right? Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, the peasants' demands for access to forests and water, their belief that these resources should be shared by the community, and their understanding of the interconnectedness between humans and nature resonate deeply with contemporary concerns about climate change and sustainability.
That's an unexpected connection, but it makes sense when you think about it. They were fighting for a way of life that was in harmony with the natural world, not just for their own benefit, but for the benefit of future generations.
Exactly. And it reveals how the Peasants' War wasn't just about some narrow political or religious agenda. It was about a fundamental vision of a more just and sustainable world, a vision that we can still learn from and be inspired by today.
You mentioned earlier that the peasants were really interested in communion in both kinds. Could you explain what that means and why it was so important to them?
Of course. Communion in both kinds refers to receiving both the bread and the wine during communion. At the time, the Catholic Church only allowed the priests to drink the wine, symbolizing the blood of Christ. But the peasants, drawing on Luther's emphasis on the importance of scripture and individual faith, believed that everyone should partake in both elements.
So it was about more than just the ritual itself. It was a symbolic challenge to the church's authority?
Precisely. It tied into their broader demands for spiritual and social equality. They saw it as a way of reclaiming their faith and empowering the community. It was a powerful symbol of their desire for a more inclusive and participatory form of religious practice.
This brings up a point that's been on my mind. The peasants were clearly influenced by Luther, but how did his contemporaries, like Zwingli and Karlstadt, factor into this? Did they have any influence on the peasant movement?
It's important to remember that the Reformation was a multifaceted movement with these various strands of thought. Zwingli, who is based in Switzerland, had his own ideas about reforming the church, and his emphasis on communal decision-making resonated with some of the peasants. However, he ultimately condemned the violence of the uprising. Karlstadt, a more radical reformer, initially sympathized with the peasants but was eventually alienated by their actions.
So it wasn't a monolithic movement with everyone in agreement about the best way forward. There were debates and disagreements within the Reformation itself, and these tensions played out during the Peasants' War.
Absolutely. The Peasants' War was a crucible in which these different ideas and personalities clashed, creating this complex and dynamic landscape of alliances, betrayals, and shifting ideologies.
The book goes into detail about specific regions and leaders. Are there any particularly notable examples that illustrate the scope and intensity of the peasant movement?
Definitely. The story of the peasants taking over the city of Würzburg is especially captivating. They surrounded the bishop's castle, which was perched on a hill overlooking the city, and demanded that the city council join their cause. The bishop's castle symbolized the power of the church, and the peasants' siege was a bold attempt to assert their own authority. It demonstrates how their movement wasn't just confined to rural areas, but also had the power to disrupt major urban centers.
It sounds like they really understood the importance of symbolic actions and how to use them to their advantage.
Absolutely. They weren't just fighting for abstract principles, they were trying to reshape their world in a very concrete way, targeting symbols of power and demanding a more equitable distribution of resources and authority.
Were there any other significant regions or battles we should know about that showcase the scale and impact of the peasant movement?
Another key area was the Alsace-Palatinate region, where 13 peasant armies united under the banner of the Holy Gospel. This was a remarkable feat of coordination and demonstrated the widespread appeal of the peasants' demands. Sadly, this united front was eventually crushed by the forces of the princes, but it shows the potential that existed for a truly transformative movement.
It's both inspiring and heartbreaking to see these glimpses of what might have been, these moments of unity and collective action that ultimately couldn't withstand the forces arrayed against them. It's fascinating to think about the ripple effects of this whole event. Even though the peasants ultimately lost, their ideas about justice and equality, they didn't just disappear, did they?
No, absolutely not. Roper makes a powerful argument that their struggle, however tragic, it had a lasting impact. Their demands for a fairer society, their understanding of the interconnectedness of humans and nature, these ideas continued to echo through history.
So you're saying that even in defeat, their fight wasn't meaningless.
Exactly. Their story became a source of inspiration for later movements for social change. Think about the English Civil War, the French Revolution. Even the fight for civil rights in the 20th century, you can see echoes of the Peasants' War in these struggles.
It's incredible how a historical event that happened over 500 years ago can still have so much resonance today. It makes you think about the struggles for social justice that are happening right now all over the world.
That's the power of history. It's not just about dates and names. It's about the enduring human quest for dignity, freedom, and a more just world. And the Peasants' War, despite its brutal ending, speaks directly to that quest.
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me. Before we wrap up, I wanted to touch on one more thing that really struck me about the book. The vivid descriptions of the violence and brutality that the peasants faced. It must have been incredibly difficult to read about those experiences.
It was, yeah. Roper doesn't shy away from the harsh realities of this period. The mass executions, the burned villages, the tales of betrayal and desperation. It's a stark reminder of the human cost of oppression and the lengths to which people will go to fight for what they believe in.
It's a sobering reminder that the fight for justice is often met with violence, and that those who challenge the status quo often pay a terrible price. But even in the face of such brutality, the peasants' courage and determination, it really shines through.
Absolutely. And their story serves as a potent reminder that we can never take our own freedoms for granted. The fight for a better world is an ongoing struggle, and it's up to each generation to pick up the torch and carry it forward.
Well, Summer of Fire and Blood is definitely going on my reading list. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and taking us on this incredible journey.
My pleasure. It's always a privilege to delve into these forgotten corners of history and discover the enduring power of human resilience and hope for a better future.
And for all of you listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. If you're as fascinated by your story as we are, be sure to check out Summer of Fire and Blood by Lyndal Roper. We'll have a link in the description below. And be sure to let us know in the comments what resonated with you the most, what surprised you, what connections did you make to our own time. We love hearing from you and engaging in these conversations. And as always, if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends. You never know who you might inspire to learn more about this fascinating and important chapter of history.